Long before the tablets of Sumer spoke of Nibiru, long before the ziggurats rose from the Mesopotamian plains, there existed a story far older and stranger than any we have been told. Tonight, we travel backward through time itself, past the cuneiform inscriptions, past the flood myths, past even the earliest whispers of civilization, to ask a question that scholars rarely dare to consider. If the Anunnaki were real, where did they truly come from? Not the celestial Nibiru of later mythology, but something older, something rooted perhaps in the very earth beneath ancient feet, in forgotten migrations, in the collective memory of humanity's deepest past. Let your eyes grow heavy now as we journey together into the mists of prehistory, where gods and mortals once walked the same uncertain ground. Let your mind drift now to a land between two rivers, where the waters of the Tigris and the Euphrates flow slowly through plains of golden reeds and dark, fertile soil, carrying with them the sediment of countless millennia and the memories of the very first cities that humanity ever built. This is Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, and it is here in the soft clay of these riverbanks that human beings first pressed reed styluses into wet earth and created the miracle of writing, preserving their thoughts, their laws, their prayers, and their gods for all the ages that would follow. Picture yourself standing on the banks of these ancient waters in a time when the cities of Uruk and Ur and Eridu and Nippur rose like dreams from the flat, endless plain, their mud brick walls glowing amber in the setting sun, their great temples called ziggurats stepping upward toward the heavens, like stairways built for gods to descend and mortals to ascend in sacred communion. The air here carries the smell of river water and sun-baked clay and the distant smoke of temple offerings, while the sound of priestly chants drifts across the evening stillness, mixing with the lowing of cattle and the gentle splash of boats along the canals that crisscross this land, like the veins of some vast living body. It is difficult for us today to truly comprehend how revolutionary these cities were, for they represented something entirely new in human experience. Permanent settlements where tens of thousands of people lived together, bound not by kinship alone, but by shared devotion to the gods who dwelt in the temples at the heart of each city, and by the written laws and records that made complex society possible for the first time. Uruk in particular deserves our lingering attention, for it was perhaps the largest city in the world, around 3000 BCE, home to somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 souls, living within walls that stretched for 6 miles, enclosing temples and palaces and workshops and homes, and the great temple precinct of Iana, dedicated to Inanna, the goddess of love and war, whose worship would echo through millennia. The very name of this city whispers to us across time, for Uruk became Erech in the Hebrew Bible and may have given its name to the land of Iraq itself, a thread of linguistic continuity connecting the ancient world to our own in ways we scarcely notice. In Ur to the south, the great ziggurat still stands in partial ruin. After 4,000 years, its massive stepped platform, a testament to the devotion and organizational power of the Sumerians, who built it without metal tools or wheeled vehicles carrying millions of mud bricks to create a mountain where no mountains existed, so that their moon god Nanna might have a dwelling place worthy of divine presence. Eridu held an even more sacred position in Sumerian consciousness, for they believed it to be the first city ever created, the place where kingship first descended from heaven, and where the god Enki, lord of wisdom and sweet waters, established his temple, the Abzu, from which all civilization flowed outward like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. And Nippur, though never a political capital, held spiritual supremacy as the home of Enlil, king of the gods, whose temple, the Ekur, was the religious heart of all Sumer, where kings came to receive divine sanction for their rule, and where the fates of nations were believed to be decreed by the assembled deities. These cities did not exist in isolation, but formed a constellation of sacred places, each with its patron deity, each with its temples and priesthoods, each contributing to a shared civilization that we call Sumerian. Though the Sumerians themselves had no single name for their collective culture, knowing themselves instead as the black-headed people and their land as the place of civilized lords. What we know of these people and their gods comes to us primarily through the clay tablets they left behind, hundreds of thousands of them discovered over the past century and a half in the ruins of temples and palaces and private homes across Iraq. The story of their recovery is itself a tale of wonder and patience, beginning in the 1840s, when European explorers and archaeologists first began systematic excavation of the great mounds that dotted the Mesopotamian landscape. Mounds that local people had long known contained the ruins of ancient cities. Imagine the moment when workers digging in the palace of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh uncovered room after room filled with clay tablets stacked like books in a library, which indeed they were. For this was the royal library, containing copies of texts gathered from across the ancient world, including myths and epics and hymns composed 1,000 years before in the Sumerian language. Though the tablets themselves were objects of humble beauty, small rectangles of clay that fit comfortably in the palm of a hand, their surfaces covered with the distinctive wedge-shaped impressions that give cuneiform its name from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge. When you hold such a tablet, and I hope someday you might have the opportunity in a museum that allows such contact, you feel the coolness of the clay against your skin, and you see the individual marks where a scribe pressed a reed stylus into the wet surface. Each impression a small triangle or line that combines with others to form signs representing syllables or words or ideas. The scribes who created these tablets underwent years of training, learning first to form the basic signs, then to combine them into words, then to master the complex literary language used for religious and royal texts, and finally to compose original works or faithfully copy the ancient texts that were considered sacred heritage. These scribes were the memory keepers of their civilization, and we owe them an unpayable debt, for without their patient work pressing reed into clay, we would know almost nothing of the rich inner world of ancient Mesopotamia, nothing of their myths and prayers, nothing of the gods they worshipped and feared and loved, including those divine beings they called the Anunnaki. Yes, and here we must pause to acknowledge a humbling truth, for though over 500,000 cuneiform tablets have been recovered from the soil of Iraq and surrounding lands, only a fraction have been fully translated and published. In museum storerooms, from London to Berlin to Philadelphia to Baghdad, thousands upon thousands of tablets wait in silence, their contents still unknown, their secrets still sealed after 4,000 years of patient waiting. What revelations might they contain? What stories? What names? What details about the gods and their origins? We simply do not know, and this uncertainty should make us humble as we proceed, for we are working with incomplete evidence, fragments of a vast civilization, much of which is lost forever. Yet what we do have is remarkable in its richness, and it tells us much about the beings. The Sumerians called the Anunnaki, a name that has echoed through the centuries, gathering new meanings and interpretations, until in our own time it has become associated with theories of ancient astronauts and alien visitors. But to understand where these modern interpretations diverge from ancient understanding, we must first grasp what the Anunnaki actually were to the people who first wrote their names in clay, who built their temples and sang their hymns, and offered their sacrifices, seeking divine favor and fearing divine wrath. The word Anunnaki itself offers our first clue, for it appears to mean something like those of princely seed or those of royal blood. Though scholars debate the precise etymology, and the meaning may have shifted over the long centuries of Mesopotamian civilization. What is clear is that the Anunnaki were not a single deity, but a group of gods, who together formed a divine assembly or council that governed the cosmos and determined the fates of gods and mortals alike. In the Sumerian understanding of the universe, the Anunnaki were the great gods, the most powerful and important deities, as distinguished from the lesser gods and spirits who populated every aspect of the natural and supernatural worlds. The chief among them was An, whose name simply means heaven or sky, and who was considered the father of the gods, the ultimate source of divine authority. Though in practice, he often delegated power to his children and remained a somewhat distant figure in the divine hierarchy. More actively involved in the affairs of the world was Enlil, whose name means Lord of the Wind or Lord of the Air, and who served as the king of the gods, the one who executed the decrees of the divine assembly, and whose word once spoken could not be changed. Enlil was associated with the city of Nippur, and his temple there was the religious center of all Sumer, the place where legitimate kingship was conferred, and where the most important religious festivals were celebrated. If Enlil represented divine authority and sometimes divine wrath, for he was responsible for sending the great flood that nearly destroyed humanity, then Enki represented divine wisdom and compassion. Enki, whose name means Lord of the Earth, though he was more particularly associated with fresh water, and the underground aquifer was the clever god, the problem solver, who repeatedly intervened to save humanity from destruction, and who was credited with teaching mortals the arts of civilization. His temple was at Eridu, the oldest of the sacred cities, and the Sumerians believed that from his watery domain, the Abzu, he sent forth the fresh waters that made life possible in the arid land between the rivers. Among the female Anunnaki, the most prominent was Ninhursag, the great mother goddess whose names were many, including Ninmah, the great lady, and Nintu, lady of birth, for she was associated with fertility and childbirth, and the very emergence of life from the earth. She appears in the creation myths as a co-creator of humanity, working alongside Enki to fashion the first humans from clay mixed with divine blood. And then there was Inanna, known later as Ishtar, whose complex character encompassed love and war, fertility and death, whose worship was among the most fervent in all Mesopotamia, and whose mythological adventures, including her famous descent to the underworld, represent some of the most sophisticated religious literature of the ancient world. These great gods did not rule alone, but were surrounded by a vast assembly of divine beings whose relationships and hierarchies were complex and sometimes contradictory, varying from city to city and from period to period as Sumerian culture evolved, and as it merged with the cultures of the Akkadians and later the Babylonians and Assyrians, who conquered and absorbed the Sumerian heritage. A crucial distinction that appears in some texts is that between the Anunnaki and the Igigi, two groups of gods whose relationship shifted over time and whose original meanings remain somewhat unclear. In earlier texts, the Anunnaki seem to be the gods of the earth and underworld, while the Igigi are the gods of heaven. But in later Babylonian texts, this distinction becomes blurred, and the Igigi are sometimes described as lesser gods who serve the Anunnaki, performing the labor of maintaining the cosmos until they rebel and humanity is created to take over their work. This narrative of divine labor and rebellion, and the subsequent creation of humanity to serve the gods, appears most fully in the Atrahasis epic, a Babylonian composition that draws on older Sumerian traditions and that offers one of the most complete ancient accounts of human origins. In this text, the Igigi gods, weary of their endless toil, digging canals and maintaining the world stage, a rebellion against the Anunnaki, burning their tools and surrounding the dwelling of Enlil in protest. The Anunnaki, in assembly, decide to create a substitute labor force, and so Enki and the mother goddess create humanity from clay mixed with the blood of a slain god, giving humans both earthly substance and a spark of divinity. This creation myth resonates with similar stories from around the world, and we shall explore those connections later in our journey. But for now, what matters is understanding how the Anunnaki functioned within Sumerian and Babylonian cosmology as the ruling council of the universe, the powers who decreed fates and judged the dead, and maintained the cosmic order that made existence possible. The Anunnaki, as judges of the underworld, feature prominently in the magnificent poem known as The Descent of Inanna, in which the goddess of love and war ventures into the realm of the dead, ruled by her sister Ereshkigal, and must pass through 7 gates, removing one piece of her royal regalia at each until she arrives naked and powerless before the throne of the underworld. There the 7 Anunnaki, who are the judges of the dead, fix upon her the eye of death, and she is killed, hung upon a hook like a piece of meat, until through the clever intervention of Enki, she is eventually restored to life, though at a terrible cost. This poem, dating from around 1900 BCE, gives us a vivid picture of how the Anunnaki were imagined as stern, implacable judges whose decrees could not be reversed and whose power extended even over the greatest of gods. The evolution of Anunnaki mythology across the centuries reveals how religious ideas transform as they pass from culture to culture and from era to era. When the Akkadian Empire united Sumer under Semitic-speaking rulers around 2334 BCE, the Sumerian gods did not disappear, but were merged with Akkadian deities, Inanna becoming Ishtar, and becoming Anu Enki, becoming Ea, in a process of religious syncretism that would continue for millennia. The Babylonians, who rose to power around 1894 BCE, inherited this mixed tradition and added their own theological innovations, most notably elevating their city god Marduk to supremacy over all the other gods. In the Enigma, Elish, the Babylonian creation epic composed around the 12th century BCE, though drawing on older materials, Marduk defeats the primordial chaos goddess Tiamat, and from her body creates the heavens. And the earth then receives the acknowledgement of all the Anunnaki who build for him the great temple of Esagila in Babylon. Here we see how the ancient Anunnaki have been subordinated to a new supreme deity, how religious traditions bend and reshape themselves to serve the political realities of empires and the devotional needs of worshippers. Throughout these transformations, certain core elements persisted: the Anunnaki as a collective of great powers, the divine assembly, where fates were decreed the creation of humanity to serve the gods, the judgment of the dead in the underworld. These elements proved remarkably durable, surviving the rise and fall of empires, the conquest of cultures, the mixing of peoples and languages, persisting in various forms, until the worship of the old gods finally faded in the early centuries of the Common Era, replaced by new faiths that nonetheless carried forward certain patterns and ideas whose origins lay in the clay tablets of ancient Sumer. But here, a question emerges from the silence of deep time, one that the tablets themselves can only partially answer. The Sumerians did not believe they had invented their gods. They believed the gods had always existed, that the worship of the Anunnaki stretched back to the very beginning of time when the world was young and gods walked openly among mortals. The king lists that Sumerian scribes compiled trace rulership back through historical kings to legendary kings whose reigns lasted thousands of years, and finally to a time before the Great Flood when kingship first descended from heaven. These are not historical records in our sense, but they reveal something important about Sumerian self-understanding. They believed their civilization, their religion, their gods had origins that stretched beyond memory into the mythic past. And archaeology confirms that something preceded Sumer, something that laid the foundations upon which Sumerian civilization was built. This was the Ubaid culture, named after the site of Tel al-Ubaid, where its distinctive pottery was first identified. A culture that flourished from around 6,500 to 3,800 BCE, establishing the first permanent settlements in southern Mesopotamia, building the first temples at sites that would later become the great Sumerian sacred cities. At Eridu, archaeologists have excavated through 17 successive temple levels, each built upon the ruins of the last, stretching back to a simple shrine from the 6th millennium BCE that already showed the same basic orientation and layout as the great temples that would follow thousands of years later. This continuity is remarkable, for it suggests that religious practices, sacred places, perhaps even divine names, were passed down across the vast gulf of time from the Ubaid people to the Sumerians who followed them. What gods did the Ubaid people worship in those simple shrines before writing existed to record their names? Did they already know the Anunnaki by some earlier name, or by no name at all, but only as felt presences, powers that inhabited the waters and the earth and the sky? Were the seeds of Sumerian religion already planted in this earlier soil, waiting to sprout into the elaborate theological systems we find in the cuneiform tablets? These questions the tablets cannot answer, for they come from a time after memory was already ancient, and they tell us only what the Sumerians believed, not what preceded their beliefs. Among the most intriguing artifacts of the Ubaid period are the clay figurines found at various sites depicting human forms, but with strangely elongated heads and narrow eyes, sometimes described as lizard-like or reptilian. These figurines, some of which appear to be female holding infants, have sparked considerable speculation among those seeking physical evidence for ancient contact with non-human beings. But most archaeologists interpret them as representations of deities or spirits whose appearance was intentionally non-human to mark their supernatural nature, or perhaps as ritual objects whose specific meaning is now lost. Now, what they certainly tell us is that the Ubaid people had complex religious beliefs that they represented supernatural beings in physical form, and that these representations do not look like ordinary humans, suggesting already a conception of divine beings as fundamentally different from mortals. The silence of these prehistoric centuries is both frustrating and beautiful, for it reminds us that the written record, which seems so solid and authoritative, is only the tip of an enormous iceberg. Most of human religious experience sank beneath the surface of history, leaving only the faintest traces in stone and clay. The Anunnaki, as we know them from the tablets, are already a mature theological concept, the product of centuries or millennia of religious development and speculation. But the Sumerians did not emerge from nothing. They carried with them memories of older times, older places, older beings. And so our journey takes us further back still into the mists of prehistory, where writing had not yet been born, and all that remains are stones, bones, and the faintest echoes of forgotten songs that once praised gods, whose names we may never know, but whose presence we can still sense in the temple foundations and the ritual objects and the strange figurines that have waited in patient silence for us to find them and to wonder. And so we journey now into the deeper darkness of time, before the first cuneiform stylus ever pressed into soft clay, before the great ziggurats rose from the plains, before even the name Sumer was spoken by human tongues, into an era that archaeologists call the Ubaid period, a span of nearly 3,000 years, stretching from roughly 6,500 to 3,800 BCE, when the foundations of everything we have discussed were being quietly, slowly, mysteriously laid. Picture, if you will, the southern reaches of what we now call Iraq, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers spread their fingers across the flat alluvial plains, depositing rich silt year after year, creating land where there had been marsh, building the very ground upon which civilization would eventually stand. And here, in this place of reeds and water and endless sky, a people whose names we will never know began to build something extraordinary, something that would echo through all the millennia to come. The Ubaid culture, named for the small mound of Tel al-Ubaid, where their distinctive pottery was first discovered in 1919, it represents the earliest continuous cultural tradition in southern Mesopotamia. And when archaeologists carefully brush away the dust of ages from their remains, they find something remarkable. Not primitive scattered settlements, but organized communities with clear social structures, specialized craftwork, long-distance trade networks, and most intriguingly for our purposes tonight, evidence of systematic religious practice centered on temple buildings that would be rebuilt again and again on the same sacred spots for thousands of years. At the ancient site of Eridu, which the Sumerians themselves would later remember as the first city ever built, the oldest city in the world, archaeologists have excavated a sequence of temples, numbering 17 distinct phases, each built directly atop the ruins of its predecessor. the earliest dating to around 5400 BCE, when the Ubaid culture was in its ascendance. And this remarkable continuity tells us something profound about these forgotten people: that they held certain places sacred, that they returned to those places generation after generation, that they maintained religious traditions with stubborn devotion across centuries and millennia, and that whatever they believed, whatever beings they venerated in those small mud brick shrines, those beliefs were strong enough and meaningful enough to be passed down from parent to child for longer than the entire span of recorded human history. Let yourself imagine for a moment the dedication required, the faith that must have burned in those ancient hearts to keep rebuilding, keep returning, keep worshipping at the same spot for 3,000 years before the Sumerians even arrived to continue the tradition. But perhaps the most haunting legacy of the Ubaid people, the aspect that has generated the most speculation and wonder, are the strange figurines that archaeologists have recovered from their sites. Small clay statuettes that depict beings unlike anything else in ancient art. Figures with elongated heads tapering to peculiar points. Faces with coffee bean-shaped eyes set at odd angles. Bodies that appear humanoid yet somehow wrong. And, most strikingly, features that many observers have described as distinctly reptilian or lizard-like. These Ubaid figurines, numbering several thousand across various excavation sites, include both male and female representations, and they have been found in contexts suggesting they held significant ritual or domestic importance, placed in graves, deposited in temples, kept in homes, and clearly handled with care and intention. What are we to make of these strange beings rendered in clay by hands that crumbled to dust 6,000 years ago? Scholars have proposed numerous interpretations, suggesting they might represent protective spirits or household guardians, depictions of deities whose appearance we cannot otherwise reconstruct, ritual objects used in ceremonies we cannot imagine, representations of ancestors rendered in stylized symbolic form, or perhaps something else entirely that lies beyond our modern categories of understanding. The honest truth is that we do not know. We cannot know with certainty what these figures meant to the people who made them. And this uncertainty, rather than frustrating us, might instead fill us with a kind of wonder. The same wonder those ancient people must have felt as they shaped these figures by firelight, pressing the clay between their fingers, giving form to beings that existed in their minds and hearts, and perhaps in their deepest beliefs in the world around them. At Tepe Gawra, another crucial Ubaid site in northern Mesopotamia, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of increasingly complex religious architecture, temples with sophisticated layouts featuring altars and offering tables, evidence of elaborate burial practices, suggesting belief in an afterlife requiring provisions and grave goods, and a social hierarchy that placed religious specialists at the apex of community organization. Here we see religion not as a casual afterthought, but as the organizing principle of society itself. And when we allow our minds to trace the line forward from Tepe Gawra to the great temple complexes of Sumerian times, we begin to sense that the Anunnaki of later mythology did not spring from nowhere. They emerged from a tradition already ancient when the first priest of Enlil took up his office, a tradition whose roots stretch back into the Ubaid darkness, where those strange elongated figures keep their eternal silent watch. Now let us venture even further back, beyond the Ubaid, beyond the first agricultural settlements of the southern plains, to a place that has revolutionized our understanding of human religious development. A place where the impossible seems to have happened, where our assumptions about the relationship between civilization and spirituality have been overturned completely. To the rounded hill of Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, where the oldest known temple complex in the world has been sleeping beneath the earth for nearly 12,000 years. Picture the landscape of southeastern Anatolia as it might have appeared around 9,600 BCE, the tail end of the last ice age, when vast herds of gazelle and wild cattle still roamed the grasslands, and humanity had not yet learned to plant seeds or domesticate animals. When we were still hunters and gatherers living in small mobile bands, when according to everything we thought we knew about human development, we should have been incapable of building anything more sophisticated than temporary shelters. And yet, here at Göbekli Tepe, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt and his team beginning in 1994 uncovered something that defied all expectations. Massive circular enclosures containing T-shaped limestone pillars standing up to 18 feet tall and weighing many tons. Their surfaces carved with elaborate reliefs depicting animals, abstract symbols, and most intriguingly for our journey tonight, humanoid figures with arms and hands but no faces. Enigmatic beings whose identity and meaning remain subjects of intense scholarly debate. The construction of Göbekli Tepe required coordinated labor on a scale that should have been impossible for hunter-gatherer societies, quarrying and transporting stones weighing up to 50 tons, carving them with precision using flint tools, erecting them in careful astronomical alignments, and maintaining the site over centuries as new enclosures were built, while older ones were deliberately, reverently, mysteriously filled with rubble and buried. Why did they build this place, these ancient people who had not yet discovered farming, who lived in a world we would scarcely recognize, who left us no written records and no direct descendants we can identify? The carvings offer tantalizing clues, the pillars depicting not domestic animals, but wild creatures, foxes and wild boar, lions and serpents, vultures and spiders, a bestiary of beings that clearly held profound significance in the spiritual imagination of these prehistoric worshippers. And among the animals appear those faceless humanoid T-shapes, pillars that seem to represent beings of a different order, not quite human, yet clearly anthropomorphic. Entities that stand at the center of each circular enclosure, as if presiding over whatever rituals took place within those sacred spaces. Klaus Schmidt proposed that Göbekli Tepe represents evidence of organized religion predating agriculture rather than following from it, suggesting that the desire to gather for worship may have been the catalyst that eventually led scattered bands to settle, to plant crops, to build the permanent communities that would become the first civilizations. If Schmidt was correct, then the impulse toward the divine, the need to venerate beings greater than ourselves, the drive to create sacred spaces and gather in their presence, may be not a product of civilization, but its very cause, the spark from which all the rest followed. And here we must pause to consider a profound possibility, that the beliefs expressed in those T-shaped pillars, those faceless humanoid presences, those wild animals rendered with such skill and reverence, did not simply vanish when Göbekli Tepe was abandoned and buried around 8000 BCE. but rather transformed and traveled, carried in the memories and practices of peoples who migrated across the centuries, south and east across the Syrian plains, down into the valleys of the great rivers, evolving and adapting with each generation until they emerged, perhaps unrecognizably changed, yet still bearing some essential core in the religion of the Ubaid and eventually in the Anunnaki of Sumerian mythology. We cannot prove this connection. The thread is too delicate, the distance too vast, the evidence too fragmentary. But we can hold it as a possibility, a wonder, a gentle speculation to carry with us as we continue through the night. Now let us consider how beliefs travel, how myths migrate, how the sacred ideas of one people become the divine truths of another, as we trace the possible paths by which religious concepts might have flowed from the mountains of Anatolia to the marshes of southern Mesopotamia across the long millennia of the Neolithic period. The Fertile Crescent, that arc of relatively well-watered land stretching from the Persian Gulf through Mesopotamia and around through the Levant to Egypt, served as the great highway of human movement in the ancient world. And along this corridor flowed not only peoples and goods, but ideas, technologies, languages, and beliefs. The development of agriculture, beginning around 10,000 BCE in the hills of the Levant and southeastern Turkey, created a slow-motion revolution that gradually spread outward, and with the knowledge of planting and harvesting came the people who carried that knowledge, migrating into new territories, absorbing or displacing existing populations, and bringing with them their gods and their stories. By 6000 BCE, agricultural communities had established themselves throughout the Fertile Crescent, and the flow of cultural influence, the endless exchange of ideas between neighboring peoples, created a web of connection across which religious concepts could travel, transforming as they went, adapting to new landscapes and new needs, but perhaps retaining at their core some essential element from their distant origins. The Sumerian language presents us with a profound puzzle in this context. For unlike Akkadian and the other Semitic languages of Mesopotamia, which clearly belong to a well-understood language family, Sumerian stands entirely alone, what linguists call a language isolate, with no known relatives anywhere in the world. This linguistic mystery has spawned numerous theories about where the Sumerians came from, some scholars arguing they were indigenous to the region whose language simply happened to be unlike their neighbors, others proposing they migrated from somewhere else entirely, perhaps from the Iranian highlands, perhaps from Central Asia, perhaps from the Indus Valley, bringing their language and presumably their religious concepts with them. The truth is, we do not know, and this uncertainty extends to the question of Anunnaki origins. For if we cannot say with confidence where the Sumerians themselves came from, how can we trace the earlier history of their gods? Yet perhaps the question is wrongly framed, for cultures do not exist in isolation, and the Sumerian religion as we know it from the tablets was clearly shaped by interaction with Semitic-speaking peoples, by absorption of earlier Ubaid traditions, by the endless cultural exchange that characterizes all human societies. The Anunnaki may not have a single point of origin at all, but rather represent a confluence of streams, divine concepts flowing from multiple sources, merging and mixing in the religious imagination of Mesopotamia until they emerged in the form recorded by the scribes. Consider how myths transform as they travel, how the flood story alone appears in dozens of cultures across the ancient Near East and beyond, each version bearing the marks of local adaptation while retaining core elements that suggest common ancestry. Stories have lives of their own, traveling further and lasting longer than the peoples who first told them. And the beings we call Anunnaki may have journeyed through human consciousness for millennia before anyone thought to write their names in clay. From the mountains of southeastern Turkey, where Göbekli Tepe kept its strange vigil, through the Syrian steppes where countless generations lived and died and passed their stories to their children, down into the alluvial plains where the Ubaid people built their temples and shaped their enigmatic figurines, and finally to the cities of Sumer where the scribes at last gave written form to traditions already impossibly old. We can imagine a great river of belief flowing through time, and the Anunnaki as something that condensed from that river, took shape, received a name, and entered history. And now we must speak of Catastrophe, of the great floods that scarred the memory of ancient peoples, and perhaps shaped their theology in ways we are only beginning to understand. For the mythology of the Anunnaki is inseparable from stories of deluge. And in the historical flooding of Mesopotamia, we may find another thread connecting the divine beings to real events lost in the depths of time. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, those givers of life that made civilization possible in the otherwise arid plains, were also bringers of death, flooding unpredictably and catastrophically, sweeping away entire villages, drowning livestock and people alike, transforming familiar landscapes overnight into vast inland seas. Archaeological evidence confirms that massive floods struck Mesopotamia repeatedly throughout its history, and some scholars have proposed that one particularly devastating deluge around 2900 BCE may have been the historical kernel around which the Sumerian flood myths crystallized. But other researchers point to an even older and more dramatic possibility, the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, which proposes that around 5600 BCE, the Mediterranean Sea broke through the narrow barrier of the Bosporus and poured catastrophically into what had been a freshwater lake, raising water levels rapidly and inundating thousands of square miles of inhabited coastline. If this event occurred as theorized by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman, it would have displaced entire populations, sending refugees fleeing in all directions, carrying with them traumatic memories that might have been preserved and transformed over millennia into the flood myths we find throughout the Near East and beyond. The Anunnaki appear in Mesopotamian flood mythology as beings intimately connected to the Great Deluge, either as its causers or as the divine powers who decided to save humanity from complete destruction through the agency of the flood hero, called Ziusudra in Sumerian, Atrahasis in Akkadian, and Utnapishtim in the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh. In some versions, the Anunnaki themselves are divided about humanity's fate, with Enlil wishing to destroy the noisy creatures who disturb divine rest, while Enki works secretly to ensure human survival. These stories suggest that flood catastrophe was not merely an event the Anunnaki presided over, but something that shaped their very nature in the Mesopotamian imagination, connecting them to the most terrifying and transformative experiences in collective memory. How deep does this connection go? If the beliefs that became Anunnaki worship traveled from the mountains of Anatolia through the Syrian plains to Mesopotamia, did they carry with them memories of other floods, other catastrophes, other brushes with extinction that left their mark on the evolving mythology. The human capacity for transmitting traumatic memory across generations is only beginning to be understood by modern researchers. But the persistence of flood myths across such vast reaches of time and space suggests that our ancestors possessed powerful means of preserving and passing down accounts of overwhelming events, embedding them in sacred stories that would be repeated, elaborated, and transformed, but never entirely forgotten. Perhaps when the ancient Mesopotamians spoke of the Anunnaki decreeing the flood, they were giving divine form to memories far older than their own civilization. Memories carried down from times of genuine catastrophe, when the world as people knew it truly ended, and only a remnant survived to begin again. The threads we follow grow ever more delicate as we reach further into the past. And yet, as we shall discover, the Anunnaki do not exist in isolation. Across the ancient world, in cultures separated by vast distances and seemingly impassable barriers, we find echoes of the same divine patterns. Perhaps, as your eyelids grow heavy and your breath grows slow, we might follow these echoes to their common source. As we travel further into the ancient world of belief and wonder, we begin to notice something quite remarkable, something that whispers to us across the vast distances of time and geography. For the Anunnaki of Mesopotamia did not exist in isolation. They were not unique in their structure or their purpose or their relationship to humanity. And as we explore the mythologies of other ancient peoples, we discover echoes, resonances, patterns that repeat themselves like the gentle rhythm of waves upon an endless shore. And these patterns invite us to ask a profound question, one that scholars have pondered for generations. Why do so many cultures separated by mountains and oceans and millennia imagine their gods in such remarkably similar ways? Let us begin with the Council of Gods, that grand assembly where divine beings gather to deliberate upon the fates of mortals and the ordering of the cosmos. In Sumer, the Anunnaki met in sacred council, presided over by and the Sky Father, or by Enlil, the Lord of the Air. And there in that celestial gathering the great gods would debate and decree. They would assign domains and responsibilities. They would judge the living and the dead. They would determine the rise and fall of kings and the fates of entire civilizations. And this image of gods assembled in council, speaking with many voices yet bound by cosmic law. This image appears again and again across the ancient world as if it were a memory shared by all humanity. Travel westward to the land of Canaan, to the peoples who would become the Phoenicians and the early Hebrews, and there you will find the divine council of El, the great Father God who presided over a heavenly assembly called the Elohim, a term that would later be used in Hebrew scripture to refer to God himself. In the oldest layers of Canaanite and early Israelite tradition, we glimpse this council at work, the sons of El gathering to receive their tasks, to govern the nations, to serve as intermediaries between the supreme deity and the mortal realm below. The structure is remarkably similar to what we find in Mesopotamia, a chief deity surrounded by subordinate divine beings, each with their own character and function, bound together in a kind of celestial government. Cross now the wine-dark seas to Greece, to the marble temples and sacred groves of the Hellenic world, and there upon Mount Olympus you will find the 12 great gods assembled under the watchful eye of Zeus the Thunderer, the father of gods and men. The Olympian Council met to debate the affairs of mortals, to take sides in human conflicts, to punish hubris and reward piety. And though the names were different and the stories wore different garments, the underlying pattern remained the same. A divine assembly, a hierarchy of powers, a chief deity whose word carried ultimate authority, yet who still consulted with his divine peers. And the Greeks had something more, something that resonates even more deeply with our Mesopotamian story. For before the Olympians, there were the Titans, an older generation of gods who ruled during a primordial age, and the relationship between Titans and Olympians mirrors in fascinating ways. The relationship between different generations of Mesopotamian deities journey further north to the frozen lands of Scandinavia, to the realm of the Norse, and there you will find the Aesir, the gods of war and sovereignty led by Odin the Allfather, and alongside them the Vanir, an older tribe of deities associated with fertility and the wealth of the earth. Norse mythology tells of a great war between these divine tribes, a conflict that ended in truce and the exchange of hostages. And after this war, the two groups merged into a single pantheon. Here again, we find the pattern of divine council, of multiple generations or tribes of gods, of conflict and eventual accommodation. Travel eastward now, far eastward to the Indian subcontinent, to the ancient traditions preserved in the Vedas, those sacred hymns composed over 3,000 years ago. And there you will encounter the Devas, the Shining Ones, gods of light and order and cosmic harmony. But the Devas did not reign alone, for there were also the Asuras, powerful beings who in the earliest texts were not evil, but simply different, another tribe of divine powers with their own domains and their own dignity. Over time, in Indian tradition, the Asuras came to be seen as adversaries of the Devas, demons opposing the gods. But in the oldest layers of the Vedas, we glimpse something more complex, two groups of divine beings, sometimes cooperating and sometimes in conflict, sharing the governance of the cosmos. And we cannot help but think of the Anunnaki and the Igigi, those two groups of Mesopotamian deities, one associated with the earth and the underworld, the other with the heavens, groups that also experienced tension and conflict, groups whose relationship shaped the mythological history of the ancient Near East. Why do so many cultures imagine their gods in council? Why do we find this pattern repeated across such vast distances? Some scholars suggest that the answer lies in human social organization itself, that we create gods in our own image, modeling divine society upon the royal courts and tribal assemblies that governed our own lives. The Sumerian city-states were ruled by councils of elders and assemblies of citizens. The word for assembly in Sumerian was unkin. And when the Sumerians imagined how the gods governed the cosmos, they naturally drew upon what they knew, a council chamber, a place of deliberation, a gathering where voices were heard and decisions were made. And perhaps this is true for all human cultures. Perhaps we cannot imagine divine governance except through the lens of human governance. We see kings and councils among ourselves, and so we place kings and councils in the heavens. There is also something deeply comforting about the image of gods in council, something that suggests that the universe is not ruled by arbitrary whim, but by deliberation and law. If the gods must consult with one another, if even the greatest deity must hear the voices of subordinate powers, then there is a kind of cosmic order, a structure that holds back chaos. And perhaps This is what ancient peoples needed to believe. That beyond the unpredictable storms and floods and plagues of mortal life, there existed a realm where order prevailed, where decisions were made carefully, where fate itself emerged from thoughtful deliberation rather than random chance. Let us turn now to another pattern that echoes across the ancient world: the divine craftsman, the god of wisdom and making, the one who shapes the world with skillful hands and teaches humanity the arts of civilization. In Mesopotamia, this role belonged to Enki, called Ea in the Akkadian tongue. Enki was the lord of the Abzu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth. He was the god of wisdom and magic and craft. And it was Enki who often served as humanity's friend and protector among the gods. In the Atrahasis epic, it was Enki who warned the hero of the coming flood. Defying the decree of the divine council to save mortal life, Enki was also associated with the Mi, those divine decrees that contained the arts and institutions of civilization, writing and kingship, music and mathematics, all the gifts that lifted humanity above mere animal existence. And Enki, in some traditions, either gave these gifts to humanity or allowed them to be taken. And here we find a pattern that stretches far beyond Mesopotamia. In Egypt, there was Ptah, the craftsman god of Memphis, who was said to have created the world through the power of his heart and tongue. Through thought and speech, Ptah was the patron of artisans and builders, the divine architect whose creative power shaped all that exists. In Canaan, there was Kothar Warkasis, whose name means skilled and clever, the divine craftsman who forged weapons for the gods and built palaces of wonder. In Greece, there was Hephaestus, the lame smith god who worked at his forge beneath the earth, creating marvels of divine craftsmanship, the armor of Achilles, the chains that bound Prometheus, the first woman Pandora shaped from clay. And speaking of Prometheus, here is perhaps the most famous divine craftsman in Western tradition, the Titan who shaped humanity from clay and then defied Zeus to bring them fire. The gift of fire was the gift of civilization itself, the technology that separated humans from beasts. And Prometheus suffered terribly for this transgression, chained to a rock where an eagle devoured his liver day after day. And yet, he remained humanity's champion, the god who valued mortal life above divine law. How similar this is to Enki, who also defied the divine council to save humanity, who also valued mortal life above the decrees of his fellow gods. The Hebrew tradition tells of the Watchers, angels who descended to earth in the days before the flood. And according to the Book of Enoch, these Watchers taught humanity forbidden knowledge, metallurgy and cosmetics, the reading of signs and the making of weapons. For this transgression they were punished, bound in darkness until the day of judgment. But their gifts remained with humanity, the arts and crafts that built civilization. Why do so many cultures tell stories of divine beings who bring the gifts of knowledge and craft to mortal hands? Perhaps because the arts of civilization seem too wonderful to have human origins. How could mere mortals have invented writing? That magical art that allows the dead to speak to the living across centuries. How could humans have discovered the secrets of metal, transforming dull stone into gleaming bronze and iron? These gifts must have come from somewhere beyond the human, from gods or angels or titanic beings who took pity on our primitive ancestors. And there is something beautiful in these stories, something that speaks to our sense of gratitude and wonder. We did not create ourselves. We did not lift ourselves from the mud by our own efforts alone. There were helpers, teachers, divine craftsmen who shaped us and gifted us with the tools we needed to become truly human. Let your mind rest now in this thought as we turn to yet another pattern, perhaps the most universal of all: the story of elder gods and younger gods. Of divine generations in conflict and succession, we have already glimpsed this pattern in the relationship between Titans and Olympians, between Asuras and Devas. But let us explore it more deeply, for it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. In Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki themselves represented the established order of divine power. But there were hints of older beings, primordial forces that existed before the gods. As we know them, took their thrones. The Enuma Elish tells of Tiamat, the saltwater ocean, and Apsu, the freshwater deep. These were the original parents, the primordial chaos from which all else emerged. And the younger gods, noisy and restless, disturbed the peace of these ancient beings, leading to conflict, leading to the slaying of Apsu by Enki, and eventually the great battle between Marduk and Tiamat. From Tiamat's divided body, Marduk fashioned the heavens and the earth, the younger god triumphant over the primordial mother, a new order established upon the body of the old. The Greeks told a similar tale. Kronos, the Titan, overthrew his father Uranus, castrating him with a sickle and claiming sovereignty over the cosmos. And Kronos ruled during a golden age. But he feared that his own children would overthrow him as he had overthrown his father. So he swallowed them one by one, until Rhea, his wife, hid the infant Zeus and gave Kronos a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes. Zeus grew to maturity in secret, then returned to free his siblings and wage war against the Titans, the great Titanomachy that ended with the Titans imprisoned in Tartarus and the Olympians reigning supreme upon their mountain throne. In Ireland, the mythology speaks of successive waves of divine and semi-divine peoples. The Fomorians were among the oldest primordial beings associated with chaos and the untamed forces of nature. After them came the Tuatha De Danann, the peoples of the goddess Danu, bright and beautiful and skilled in magic. The Tuatha De Danann fought great battles against the Fomorians, eventually defeating them and claiming sovereignty over the land. And later, still the Tuatha De Danann themselves retreated before the coming of mortal men, withdrawing into the hollow hills to become the fairy folk of later legend. What does this pattern mean? Why do so many cultures tell of older gods giving way to younger gods, of primordial powers defeated and displaced by newer, more dynamic deities? Some scholars see in these myths the memory of religious change. When one people conquers another, the gods of the conquerors naturally triumph over the gods of the conquered. The old gods do not disappear entirely. They are too deeply rooted in the land and in human memory, but they are demoted, transformed into defeated titans or faded fairies or demons dwelling in the outer darkness. Perhaps the Anunnaki themselves represent such a transition. Perhaps they were once the highest gods of some older tradition, later subordinated to Marduk of Babylon or Ashur of Assyria as political power shifted across Mesopotamia. Others see psychological meaning in these myths. The conflict between elder and younger gods mirrors the conflict between generations in human society, parents and children, tradition and innovation, the weight of the past and the energy of the future. Every generation must, in some sense, overthrow the generation before, must establish its own identity and claim its own place in the world. And perhaps these divine myths give cosmic sanction to this eternal human pattern. They tell us that change is natural, that new orders arise from old, that even the gods experience the turning of the ages. Still others wonder if these myths preserve genuine memories of historical transitions, not between human cultures, but between different phases of human religious experience. Perhaps there was indeed an older form of spirituality, a way of relating to the sacred that preceded the organized polytheism of the ancient civilizations. Perhaps the elder gods represent the misty recollection of this older way, now overlaid and transformed by later theological developments. We cannot know for certain. The origins lie too far back in time, shrouded by millennia of retelling and reinterpretation. But we can rest in the recognition of pattern, in the comfort of knowing that across all human cultures, we have told ourselves similar stories, stories of divine succession, of cosmic order emerging from primordial chaos, of each age giving way to the next in an eternal rhythm of change and continuity. And now let us come to the most intimate of all these patterns, the creation of humanity itself. How did we come to be? What are we made of? Why do we exist? These questions have haunted human consciousness since the first dawn of awareness, and the answers our ancestors gave echo across the world with haunting similarity. In Mesopotamia, the Atrahasis epic tells how the Anunnaki grew weary of the labor required to maintain the world. The younger gods, the Igigi, refused to continue their toil, and so Enki devised a solution. Humanity would be created to bear the burden of work, to serve the gods and free them from labor. The mother goddess Nintu took clay from the earth and mixed it with the blood of a slain god. And from this mixture the first humans were shaped. We are earth and divine essence combined, mortal clay animated by the spark of godhood. In Egypt, different cities told different creation stories, but many shared the theme of humanity emerging from the gods themselves. One tradition held that humans sprang from the tears of Ra, the sun god. Another, that they were shaped upon a potter's wheel by the ram-headed god Khnum. Again and again we find the elements: divine origin, intentional creation, the shaping of mortal form from base material enlivened by divine power. The Hebrew scriptures tell of God forming Adam from the dust of the ground and breathing into his nostrils the breath of life. The same elements appear: earth as raw material, divine breath as animating spirit, intentional creation by a purposeful deity. Humanity is not an accident but a decision, not random emergence but careful crafting. In Greece, Prometheus shaped humanity from clay, forming us in the image of the gods, and Athena breathed life into his creation, giving us souls and consciousness. In China, the goddess Nuwa grew lonely, wandering the empty earth, and so she took yellow clay from the riverbank and began to shape little figures. These she animated with her divine breath, and they became the first humans. When she grew tired of shaping each figure individually, she dipped a rope in the mud and flicked it across the ground. The droplets became common people, while those she had shaped carefully by hand became the nobles and aristocrats. Why do we imagine ourselves as created beings? Why do so many cultures tell of gods shaping us from earth and animating us with divine essence? Perhaps because the alternative is too lonely to contemplate. If we simply emerged, if we arose by chance from the mindless workings of nature, then we are truly alone in the cosmos. There is no one who intended us, no one who wanted us to exist, no one whose purpose we might serve. or whose love we might receive. But if we were created, if some divine power shaped us with deliberate care, then we are wanted. We belong. Our existence has meaning beyond mere accident. And there is something else in these creation myths, something that speaks to the mystery of our own nature. We are compound beings, earth and spirit, dust and divine breath. We know ourselves to be of the earth, mortal and limited, destined to return to the soil from which we came. And yet we also sense something more within us, a spark that does not seem entirely material, a capacity for wonder and creativity and love that lifts us above mere animality. The creation myths acknowledge and explain this dual nature. We are clay because we come from the earth. We are divine because a god breathed life into us. And in the Mesopotamian version, there is an additional layer. The blood of a slain god was mixed with the clay, making us literally part divine, carriers of divine essence in mortal vessels. The Anunnaki created us to serve. This is true. The myths are frank about humanity's original purpose as laborers for the gods. And yet, in giving us divine blood, they also gave us something of themselves. We are not merely tools. We are kin, distant and diminished perhaps, but sharing in the divine substance that animates the cosmos. And so we find that the Anunnaki, far from being unique to Mesopotamia, may represent something far older and more universal in the human soul. The divine council, the craftsman god, the elder and younger generations of divinity, the creation of humanity from earth and divine essence. These patterns appear wherever human beings have gathered to tell stories about the sacred. Perhaps they spread through ancient cultural contact, traders and migrants carrying tales from land to land across the millennia. Perhaps they arise independently from the structure of the human mind itself, from ways of thinking and imagining that are simply part of what it means to be human. Or perhaps, and here we enter the realm of wonder and mystery, perhaps they preserve genuine memories of something that happened long ago, something experienced by our earliest ancestors, something that left such a deep impression upon human consciousness that it could never be fully forgotten, only transformed and retold in 1,000 different tongues. We cannot know for certain, and perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps the mystery is itself a kind of answer, a reminder that some things lie beyond the reach of certain knowledge, inviting us not to frustration, but to wonder. But scholars do not deal only in myths and symbols. They seek what can be touched and measured, what can be dated and analyzed. And so in the next passage of our journey, we shall examine what the stones and bones, the physical evidence of the past, might tell us about the origins of these ancient beliefs. Let your mind drift now as we turn to the patient work of archaeology, to the quiet excavations and careful scholarship that have slowly unearthed the material foundations of the ancient world. Rest easy as we descend once more into the earth, following the archaeologist's lamp into the darkness where the past still sleeps, waiting to be awakened by gentle hands and wondering minds. And now we turn to what the patient earth itself has revealed to those who dig carefully into its layers, to the archaeologists and linguists and scholars who have spent generations piecing together the fragments of the ancient world. And as we explore their discoveries together, you may find your thoughts settling into a quieter rhythm. For there is something deeply soothing about the slow and methodical work of understanding the past. Archaeology is both a science of limitations and a science of wondrous possibilities. For while we can never truly know what ancient peoples thought or felt or believed in the privacy of their hearts, we can hold in our hands the objects they held. We can walk through the foundations of their temples. We can trace the outlines of their sacred spaces. And from these physical remnants, we can begin to imagine the beliefs that once animated their world. The work happens in quiet places now, in museum archives where the light is carefully controlled to protect fragile artifacts, in university offices where scholars spend years studying a single collection of tablets, in the hushed storage rooms where clay figurines and cylinder seals rest in carefully labeled drawers, waiting for the next generation of researchers to ask new questions of them. There is a gentleness to this work, a patience that spans not just individual careers, but entire lifetimes, entire centuries of accumulated knowledge passed from teacher to student, from one careful hand to another. And in this transmission of understanding, we find a kind of secular priesthood devoted to preserving and interpreting the memories of the ancient world. The temple excavations of Mesopotamia have revealed something remarkable about the persistence of sacred belief across enormous stretches of time. For at sites like Eridu, which the Sumerians themselves considered the oldest city in the world, archaeologists have uncovered not one temple, but 17 temples, built one on top of another over thousands of years, each new structure raised upon the foundations of the one before, each generation choosing to honor the same sacred spot that their ancestors had honored, their great-grandparents had honored, their distant forebears reaching back into the mists of prehistory had honored. Imagine, if you will, the first small shrine at Eridu, perhaps nothing more than a simple reed structure with an offering table, built sometime in the 6th millennium before the Common Era. And then imagine the centuries flowing past like water, each generation adding to or rebuilding this sacred space. The reed shrine becoming a mud brick chapel, the chapel becoming a modest temple, the modest temple becoming a grand ziggurat complex, all of it growing organically from that first impulse to mark a particular piece of ground as holy. What does this continuity tell us about the Anunnaki, about the gods who were worshipped in these ever-growing sacred spaces? It tells us that whatever beliefs first took root at Eridu, whatever divine presence was first sensed there by people whose names we will never know, those beliefs had a remarkable staying power, a persistence that suggests they answered something deep and enduring in the human need for connection with the sacred. The votive offerings found in these temple layers speak their own quiet language, small figurines with wide eyes and clasped hands, humble gifts of food and precious objects, tokens of devotion that accumulated over millennia in the sacred precincts. And, though the specific prayers that accompanied these offerings have been lost to time, the gesture itself remains perfectly legible across the ages. For we too know what it means to bring a gift to something greater than ourselves, to make an offering in hope of blessing or protection, or simply acknowledgement from powers we cannot fully comprehend. The linguistic evidence presents its own beautiful mystery, for Sumerian stands alone among the languages of the ancient world, an isolate with no known relatives, no clear family tree connecting it to other tongues. When scholars first deciphered Sumerian in the 19th and 20th centuries, they expected to find connections to other language families, perhaps to Semitic languages like Akkadian, perhaps to Indo-European tongues, perhaps to something else entirely. But what they found instead was a language that seems to have emerged from nowhere, or more accurately, from somewhere we cannot trace. This linguistic isolation tells us something profound about the Sumerians themselves, for a language reflects the history of its speakers, and a language without relatives suggests a people whose origins remain genuinely mysterious. Did the Sumerians migrate into Mesopotamia from some unknown homeland, bringing their unique language with them? Did their language develop in isolation over such vast stretches of time that any relatives have simply been lost? We do not know, and this not knowing extends to their religious vocabulary as well. The names of the Anunnaki, An and Enlil and Enki and Ninhursag and all the others. These names appear in Sumerian, but their ultimate etymology often remains uncertain. And while some scholars have proposed connections to words meaning sky, or wind, or earth, or water, others argue that the divine names are older than the descriptive meanings we try to attach to them, that the gods were named first, and the names were explained afterward. What we can trace is how these divine names traveled across languages, as Sumerian gave way to Akkadian, and Akkadian gave way to Babylonian and Assyrian. How An became Anu, how Enlil was borrowed wholesale into the Akkadian pantheon, how Enki became Ea, but retained his essential character as the wise god of sweet waters and secret knowledge. This borrowing of divine names tells us that the gods themselves were felt to transcend the particular languages used to invoke them. That an Akkadian speaker praying to Ea understood themselves to be addressing the same divine power that a Sumerian speaker had addressed as Enki centuries before. And here we encounter something strangely moving, for Sumerian persisted as a sacred and scholarly language long after it ceased to be spoken in daily life, much as Latin persisted in medieval Europe, and Akkadian priests learned Sumerian in order to read the ancient hymns and perform the ancient rituals, preserving words whose everyday meanings they sometimes struggled to understand, but whose sacred power they still respected. The voices of those original Sumerian priests have been silent now for 4,000 years. The last native speaker of Sumerian passed from this world sometime in the early 2nd millennium before the Common Era, and yet we can still read their prayers. We can still sound out the syllables they used to call upon the Anunnaki, and in this strange act of reading, we achieve a kind of intimacy with the ancient dead that still has the power to move scholars who have devoted their lives to these texts. The question of where the Anunnaki mythology ultimately came from has generated several scholarly theories, each offering its own perspective on this ancient puzzle. And as we explore these theories together, there is no need to choose among them, for they may all contain partial truths, different windows onto the same vast and complex reality. The first theory we might call indigenous development, and it proposes that the Anunnaki emerged organically from the religious imagination of the people who lived in Mesopotamia, evolving gradually over millennia from simpler forms of belief into the elaborate theological system we find in the cuneiform tablets. In this view, the earliest inhabitants of the region, long before they could be called Sumerians, long before cities existed or writing was invented, practiced a form of animistic religion in which spirits inhabited the natural world around them. The rivers and marshes and date palms and wild animals all possessing their own vital essences. Over time, these nature spirits became more defined, more personalized, more human-like in their appearance and behavior, until eventually they crystallized into the recognizable gods of the Sumerian pantheon. An the Skyfather, Enlil the Wind Lord, Enki the Master of the Watery Depths, each deity emerging from the personification of natural forces that the people of Mesopotamia encountered every day of their lives. This theory has the elegance of explaining the Anunnaki without requiring outside influences, suggesting that the specific geography and ecology of Mesopotamia shaped its specific gods, that people who lived between two great rivers and depended on irrigation would naturally develop water gods, that people who watched the dramatic storms sweeping across the flat plains would naturally develop storm gods, that the particular landscape gave birth to its particular pantheon. And yet, this theory leaves some questions unanswered, for it does not fully explain the similarities between Mesopotamian religion and other ancient traditions. Nor does it account for the Sumerians' own sense that their civilization had been founded from elsewhere. A second theory points northward, toward the mountains of Anatolia and the remarkable sacred sites that have been discovered there, suggesting that the roots of Anunnaki belief may extend back to Göbekli Tepe and its contemporaries, carried southward into Mesopotamia through generations of migration and cultural exchange. In this view, the massive T-shaped pillars of Göbekli Tepe, carved with mysterious beings and assembled into circular enclosures 11,000 years ago, represent an early form of the organized religion that would eventually flourish in Sumer. And the people who built these monuments, or their descendants, gradually moved southward over millennia, carrying their beliefs with them as they went. The carved beings on the Göbekli Tepe pillars, humanoid but faceless, adorned with belts and symbols, arms positioned in gestures whose meanings we can only guess at. These might represent proto-deities, early versions of divine concepts that would eventually become the Anunnaki after thousands of years of theological development. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe around 8000 BCE, when the site was intentionally filled in and abandoned, might mark a transition point when the religious center of gravity shifted southward toward the emerging settlements of Mesopotamia. This theory is attractive because it provides a deep backstory for Mesopotamian religion, connecting it to the very origins of organized worship. But it remains speculative because the gaps in the archaeological record are so vast, or because thousands of years separate Göbekli Tepe from the first Sumerian texts, and we cannot trace the connections with certainty. A third theory approaches the question from the realm of psychology rather than archaeology, drawing on the work of Carl Jung and others who have proposed that certain religious patterns are built into the human mind itself. In this view, the Anunnaki are a local expression of universal archetypes, patterns that emerge spontaneously from the collective unconscious of humanity whenever people gather together and begin to develop complex societies. The divine council, the creator god, the wise trickster, the great mother, these figures appear not just in Mesopotamia, but across the world, because the human mind naturally generates them. Because something in our psychological architecture predisposes us to imagine the divine in these particular shapes. This theory explains the remarkable similarities between Mesopotamian religion and other ancient traditions without requiring any historical contact between them, suggesting instead that parallel development from shared psychological roots accounts for the recurring patterns. If this theory is correct, then the Anunnaki are not so much a historical mystery to be solved as a psychological reality to be understood, an expression of something deep in human nature that found its particular form in the culture and landscape of ancient Mesopotamia. And there is something comforting in this view, for it suggests that when we read the ancient myths, we are not encountering something utterly alien, but something profoundly human, a mirror reflecting our own minds back to us across thousands of years. A fourth theory draws on the ancient tradition of euhemerism, the idea that gods are memories of actual human beings whose deeds became legendary and whose legends became divine. In this view, the Anunnaki were originally human ancestors, perhaps great leaders or founders or sages whose accomplishments so impressed their descendants that over generations the stories about them grew larger and larger until these ancestral figures were remembered not as mortals, but as gods. The Sumerian king lists, those ancient documents that trace royal succession back into impossibly distant times, list rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years before the flood. And some scholars suggest that these mythical kings represent a bridge between historical memory and theological imagination, human rulers who became divine through the long process of legendary inflation. If the Anunnaki began as deified ancestors, this would explain why they are so often described in human terms, why they quarrel and scheme and love and rage like the mortals who worship them, why they form family relationships and hierarchies that mirror human social structures. And in many ancient societies, we can observe this process of deification happening in real time. We can watch as deceased kings become objects of religious veneration, as their tombs become shrines, as their spirits are believed to intercede for the living. And it requires no great leap of imagination to see how this process extended over thousands of years might transform human memories into divine mythology. Each of these theories offers something valuable to our understanding, and perhaps the wisest approach is to hold them all lightly, recognizing that the origins of the Anunnaki are almost certainly more complex than any single explanation can capture. Religious traditions do not emerge from single sources. They develop through processes of accumulation and synthesis, drawing on indigenous beliefs and foreign influences and psychological patterns and ancestral memories, all woven together into tapestries whose individual threads can never be fully separated. The Anunnaki, as we encounter them in the ancient texts, are the product of thousands of years of theological development, layer upon layer of meaning deposited like sediment. And when we try to trace them back to a single origin, we may be asking the wrong question entirely, for perhaps they have no single origin. Perhaps they emerged from the confluence of many streams. And here we must acknowledge something important, something that scholars of the ancient world know intimately, but that popular accounts sometimes forget. And that is the profound limitation of our knowledge, the vast darkness that surrounds the small circle of what we can actually know about the past. For every tablet that has survived, thousands have been lost. For every site that has been excavated, hundreds remain buried. For every ancient voice that speaks to us through the texts, millions were never recorded at all, living and dying in the long millennia before writing was invented, but leaving behind only the faintest traces in the archaeological record. The honest scholar must confess that we do not know where the Anunnaki came from, not with certainty, not with the kind of definitive proof that would settle the question once and for all. We have theories and evidence and interpretations. We have the patient work of generations of researchers. We have the fragments that time has spared, but we do not have the full picture and we likely never will. And yet, there is something beautiful in this uncertainty, something that should not make us anxious, but rather should invite us into a posture of humility and wonder. The mystery of the Anunnaki is part of their enduring fascination, and a mystery fully solved would in some ways be a mystery diminished. Perhaps it is enough to know that ancient peoples, not so different from ourselves in their hopes and fears and longings, looked at the world around them and sensed the presence of powers greater than themselves, and gave those powers names, and built temples to honor them, and told stories about them, and passed those stories down through countless generations until they reached us, still carrying their strange and luminous power across the abyss of time. As you rest here in the darkness, letting these thoughts drift through your mind like clouds across a quiet sky, you need not reach any conclusions. You need not solve any puzzles. You may simply let the mystery be what it is, a gift from the ancient world that asks nothing of us except our attention and our wonder. And so we arrive at the shores of uncertainty, where scholarship meets wonder and knowledge meets imagination. As our journey nears its end, let us gather what we have learned and hold it gently, as one holds a handful of sand from an ancient riverbed, knowing that some grains will always slip through our fingers. And so, we arrive at the place where all the threads we have followed begin to weave together, where the scattered fragments of evidence and theory and ancient memory converge into something resembling, if not a complete picture, then at least a tapestry rich enough to warm us as we rest. What were the Anunnaki truly before the later scribes placed them among the stars, before modern writers reimagined them as visitors from distant worlds? The answer, as with so many things in the study of deep antiquity, is not singular but multiple, not simple but beautifully complex. A convergence of streams flowing from many sources into one great river. They were, perhaps first and foremost, the inheritors of religious concepts that stretched back into the Neolithic darkness, ideas about divine beings and cosmic order that traveled with migrating peoples from the mountains of Anatolia, from places like Göbekli Tepe, where massive stone pillars carved with mysterious figures once stood beneath open skies. Ideas that were carried generation after generation across the Fertile Crescent until they found their fullest expression in the temple cities of Sumer. But the Anunnaki were also something more universal, a manifestation of patterns that seem to emerge wherever human minds contemplate the divine, the council of gods deliberating on matters of fate, the wise craftsman deity who teaches humanity the arts of civilization, the elder powers who give way to younger and more dynamic forces. These are not uniquely Mesopotamian ideas, but human ideas, arising independently or perhaps from some common source, so ancient that its origins are lost even to archaeology. The Anunnaki represented too the specific genius of Mesopotamian civilization, the remarkable theological sophistication of a people who invented writing and used it to record their understanding of the cosmos, who built temples that reached toward heaven and imagined the gods descending to dwell within them, who created a religious literature of such depth and beauty that we are still moved by it today, thousands of years after the last cuneiform scribe set down his stylus. And they were likely also, in some measure, the distant memories of ancestors and cultural heroes transformed by the passage of centuries into divine beings. the great kings and queens of the earliest cities, the wise men and women who first taught the arts of irrigation and metallurgy and writing, remembered not as mortals, but as gods, because their gifts seemed too great to have come from merely human hands. No single explanation captures the whole truth, and perhaps this is as it should be, for the Anunnaki were never a simple thing, never a single concept frozen in time, but a living tradition that evolved and grew and changed across millennia, absorbing new influences, adapting to new circumstances, yet maintaining always that core identity as the great gods, the princely ones, the powers who shaped the world and determined the fate of humanity. It was only later, in the Babylonian period, that the Anunnaki began their journey toward the stars, as the priests of Babylon developed an increasingly sophisticated astronomical religion in which the movements of celestial bodies came to be associated with divine powers and cosmic meaning. Nibiru entered the mythology not as a planet in the modern sense, not as a distant world harboring alien civilizations, but as a celestial marker, a point of crossing in the heavens where the paths of the gods intersected, a concept that reflected the Babylonian genius for astronomy and their desire to find divine order in the movements of the stars. The gods who had once walked the earth, who had built cities and taught humanity and judged the dead in the underworld, were gradually projected outward into the cosmos, and their mythology enriched with celestial imagery even as it lost some of its earthly rootedness. And then, in our own time, writers seeking to explain the mysteries of ancient civilization reinterpreted these celestial associations in terms of modern science fiction, imagining the Anunnaki as extraterrestrial visitors from a literal planet called Nibiru, reading the ancient texts through the lens of contemporary concerns about space travel and alien contact. There is a certain irony in this modern interpretation, for in reaching toward the stars to explain the Anunnaki, we may have looked in precisely the wrong direction, when the ancient peoples themselves seem to have understood these beings as deeply connected to the earth, to the rivers and mountains and cities of Mesopotamia, to the soil from which they shaped humanity, and the underworld to which they consigned the dead. The enduring fascination with the Anunnaki speaks to something deep within the human spirit, something that has not changed in the thousands of years since the first scribes pressed their reeds into wet clay to record the names and deeds of the great gods. We are creatures who need origin stories, who cannot rest content without some account of where we came from and why we are here. And the Anunnaki offer one of the oldest and most elaborate answers to these eternal questions. Each generation that encounters these ancient texts finds something different in them, something that speaks to the concerns and questions of their own time. And this is not a failure of understanding, but a testament to the richness of the mythology itself, its capacity to hold meaning across vast gulfs of time and culture. The Anunnaki serve as a mirror in which we see ourselves reflected, our hopes and fears about our own origins, our desire to believe that we are more than mere accidents of evolution, that our existence has meaning and purpose and divine sanction. And perhaps this is the deepest truth about the Anunnaki, that they tell us as much about ourselves as they do about the ancient world, that in studying them we are really studying the human need for meaning, for connection to something greater, for stories that make sense of the chaos and wonder of existence. Let these questions settle now like dust motes in still air. There is no need to resolve them tonight, No need to reach for certainty where mystery offers its own deeper comfort. The Anunnaki will still be there in the morning, waiting in their clay tablets and crumbling temples, patient as they have been patient for millennia, keeping their secrets while offering just enough to sustain our wondering. For now, let the ancient names grow soft in your mind. Let Anu and Enlil and Enki become not puzzles to be solved, but companions for your drifting thoughts, presences as gentle and impersonal as the night itself. The questions that moved those first Sumerian priests to write their hymns are the same questions that move us still, and there is something comforting in that continuity, something that connects us across all the centuries of silence to those distant ancestors who first looked up at the same stars we see tonight and wondered about the powers that shaped their world. Let that connection hold you now as you rest. Let the great unbroken thread of human wonder carry you gently towards sleep, knowing that you are part of a story far older and far larger than any single lifetime. A story that began before the Anunnaki had names and will continue long after we ourselves have returned to the dust, from which the ancient tablets tell us we were first formed by divine hands in the days when gods still walked the earth. And so we return at last to where we began, to the quiet of the night, to the darkness that has always been humanity's oldest companion, the same darkness that fell over the cities of Sumer 5,000 years ago, when the temple priests finished their evening hymns and the oil lamps flickered low in the ziggurats, and the people of Uruk and Ur and Eridu closed their eyes, just as you are closing yours now. Those ancient ones who first whispered the names of the Anunnaki, who pressed their reed styluses into soft clay to record the deeds of Enlil and Enki, and the great assembly of divine beings. They have long since returned to the earth they once walked, sleeping now beneath the very sands that archaeologists sift with such patient care. Their voices silent, but somehow still present in the words they left behind. The tablets they inscribed rest now in museum cases across the world, in London and Paris and Baghdad and Philadelphia, being quiet and patient in their glass enclosures, holding stories that have outlasted empires and will outlast us too, waiting to be read by future generations who will bring their own questions and their own wonder to these ancient mysteries. And in Iraq and Syria and Turkey, the ruins of temples and palaces still stand beneath the desert stars, the same stars that the Mesopotamians watched with such devoted attention. And if you were to walk among those crumbling walls tonight, you might feel in the stillness and the starlight some faint presence of all those who came before, all those who asked the very questions we have been asking together through this long and wandering journey. Where did the Anunnaki come from, we wondered, and perhaps the truest answer is that they came from the same place all gods come from the depths of the human heart and the reaches of the human imagination, from our need to understand the world and our place within it, from memories stretching back through countless generations to the very dawn of our species, when we first looked up at the night sky and felt something vast and mysterious looking back. These questions pass from generation to generation like heirlooms, like treasures, like the soft glow of a lamp passed from one hand to another in an endless chain of light stretching from the first campfires of prehistory to this very moment now. And there is something beautiful in not having final answers, something peaceful in letting mysteries remain mysterious, something restful in knowing that wonder itself is the destination, not a waypoint on the road to certainty. So let these ancient stories carry you now. Let them be a river bearing you gently towards sleep. Let the names of forgotten gods be a lullaby sung across millennia. Let the image of starlight falling on ziggurat stones be the last picture in your mind as you drift away from waking thought. The Anunnaki keep their secrets, as they have always done, as they always will, and that is good, that is right. That is how ancient things should be. Rest now, rest. Let the questions go. Let the wondering cease. Let the long history of human imagination wrap around you like a blanket woven from 10,000 years of dreams. You are part of this story too, part of this ancient chain of seekers and dreamers. And tonight, you add your own rest to the great rest of all those who came before. Sleep now, sleep. Let the old gods keep their watch while you wander in your own dreams. And may those dreams be gentle and strange, and full of starlight falling on ancient stones.